Now I want to put everything in perspective. When my son was in second grade, I was driving the carpool. He was sitting in the back seat, and his friend who was sitting next to him said, "What does your father do for a living?" And my son said, "He gives boring speeches." I warned you, right? Okay. He's a law professor today, by the way. Right? So he gives boring speeches. Okay, I want to suggest a virtual Copernican revolution in how the Jewish tradition and Jews along with it should understand and treat disabilities. In order to describe this new view, I need first to summarize what the Jewish tradition has said in the past. I think it is fair to say that from the very start, that traditional Judaism's approach to disability is remarkably enlightened and compassionate, especially when compared to the treatment of disabled people in other cultures. Before we get to the specific legal aspects of this, note that almost all of the biblical heroes were disabled in some way. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Hannah are all barren for some time in their lives. Isaac and Jacob suffer from blindness in their old age. Jacob was lame for most of his life, and even the greatest biblical hero, Moses, suffered from a speech impediment. Similarly, a number of Talmudic rabbis were disabled. For example, Nahum of Gamzu, Dosa ben Hyrcanus, Rav Yosef, and Rav Sheshet were all blind. The more manly biblical models, Esau, Gideon, Samson, and even David, are all portrayed as flawed in character. In contrast, the heroes of Greek and Roman culture were all physically perfect, even extraordinary. American secular culture applauds those who overcome disabilities, along with those who triumph over any obstacles, and some popular movies like Philadelphia and some country songs like Mark Will's Don't Laugh at Me warn us not to ignore or denigrate the homeless or ill. But very few, if any, commercials depict disabled people or even old people because Americans honor youth and ability. That is why Franklin Delano Roosevelt insisted on hiding his wheelchair in the last years of his presidency. Thus, the fact that so many of the biblical and rabbinic heroes were disabled in various ways speaks volumes about how our tradition from its very beginnings thought of this group of people. In contrast to Greek, Roman, and American cultures, in Jewish sources, the disabled were to be construed like everyone else, and they were often leaders. This stems from some deep Jewish convictions. For the Jewish tradition, we are all created in the image of God, and as such, we have divine worth independent of whatever we do. That does not mean that we may do whatever we want. Quite the contrary, God gives us 613 commandments, and the rabbis add a few more. Moreover, the fact that each person is created in the image of God does not mean that we have to like everyone or what everyone does. It does mean, though, that even when we judge a person harshly for his or her actions, we must still recognize the divine worth in that person. The extreme illustration of that is when the Torah demands in Deuteronomy 21 that if a man is guilty of a capital offense and is put to death, and you impale him on a stake, you must not let his corpse remain on the stake overnight, but must bury him the same day. For an impaled body is an affront to God, literally a curse of God, kilalat Elohimhi. That is, the image of God inherent in even such a person must be honored. How much the more so must we honor the image of God in those who have not committed heinous crimes, but happen to be disabled in some way. The Jewish tradition is remarkable not only in how it thought about the disabled, but in the actions it demanded with and for them. In Greek and Roman cultures, imperfect, quote-unquote, infants were put out to die, and disabled adults were left to fend for themselves and often mocked to boot. In Jewish culture, in contrast, killing an infant for any reason constitutes murder, and the Torah specifically prohibits cursing the deaf or putting a stumbling block before the blind. As Jews, we dare not forget these fundamental features of our tradition's thought and practice. On the contrary, Given how other cultures treated the disabled, we should take pride in the fundamental humanity embedded in our own tradition. With this as a background, though, it is also important that we acknowledge that Jewish sources did put the disabled at some disadvantage. This especially affected the temple and the biblical concept of the holy. Specifically, while disabled men born into the priestly class were not denied their part of the priestly portions, they were not allowed to serve in the temple and were instead put to menial work such as cleaning the kindling wood from worms, for which a special area was set aside. According to Leviticus 21, no one at all who has a defect shall be qualified to offer a sacrifice. No man who is blind or lame or has a limb too short or too long. No man who has a broken leg or a broken arm or who is hunchback or a dwarf or who has a growth in his eye or has a boil scar or scurvy or crushed testes. Maimonides explains the exclusion on the grounds that most people, I'm quoting him now, most people do not estimate a person by his true form, but by his limbs and his clothing, and the temple was to be held in great reverence by all. Somehow, for the Torah and Maimonides, one could be disabled and still function as the people's political leader, but one could not serve in the sacred precincts of the temple. One verse in Deuteronomy even says that a man who has crushed testes or a severed penis, quote, may not come into the congregation of the Lord, end quote. It is not clear whether that only refers to a man who voluntarily maimed himself that way in service of some Canaanite god, or whether it refers to any man in that condition, and we also do not know the meaning or implications of not coming into the congregation of the Lord. But it clearly constitutes an exclusion of such men from normal status. Now, as we turn from ancient rites to Jewish law now in practice, I shall summarize the various categories of disability and how the rabbis treated them. In all fairness, by and large, the rabbis limited any legal restrictions on the disabled to the specific tasks the disability prevented them from doing, seeing such people otherwise as full-fledged Jews. That is, the rabbis did not dismiss the disabled categorically from Jewish responsibilities and roles. They instead sought to empower them as much as possible. Still, rabbinic law does impose some limitations on them in both ritual and civil law. Here, then, are some of the rulings regarding the disabled in Jewish ritual law. First, blind people should say the blessing before the Shema that praises God for creating light, because even though they cannot see the light of day, they benefit from it because others see them and keep them from accidents. Similarly, even though the third paragraph of the Shema commands us to wear fringes so that we may see them and thereby remember God's commandments, blind people are obligated to wear fringes because others can see them. Along the same lines, even though the Shema begins, "Hear, O Israel," a deaf person who by definition cannot hear either the command or his or her own voice saying the prayer can nevertheless fulfill the commandment of reciting the Shema because others can hear him or her saying the prayer. Since the Torah must be read and not recited by heart, however, blind people may not serve as the Torah reader. But they may be called up to recite the blessings over the Torah, and they may read the Haftarah from a Braille text, or even recite it by heart. A deaf person may read from the Torah, as well as recite the blessings over it. A blind person may lead the congregation in prayer as Shaliach Tzibur, because blindness does not free a Jew from the duty to pray. And contrary to reading the Torah, one may pray by heart. A Cheresh, probably here a deaf mute. One of the problems is that the Mishnah defines a Cheresh as a deaf mute, whereas the Talmud understands the person as simply deaf and uses the word Elaim for a mute. And so part of the problem is that we've got, every time the Jewish law uses the word Cheresh, you don't know whether you're talking about simply a deaf person or a deaf mute person. So a Cheresh, probably here a deaf mute, cannot fulfill the obligation of the community to hear the Purim Megillah read because such a person cannot speak audibly. Despite some arguments to the contrary, a blind person is obligated to recite the Haggadah of Passover, as two great blind Talmudic scholars, Rav Sheshet and Rav Joseph, did. A blind person may not serve as a kosher slaughterer, for one must see clearly to cut firmly and quickly to minimize the animal's pain. A deaf mute or even a shoteh, however, may serve in this capacity if they are supervised by a person who knows how to do this and who attests that the slaughter fulfilled the requirements of Jewish law. Finally, a cheresh, a shoteh, somebody who is insane, and a minor are not obligated to hear the shofar blown on Rosh Hashanah, and therefore are not eligible to fulfill the commandment for others if they blow it. The later codes specify that this applies only to a deaf person, but a hearing person, even if mute, is obliged to hear the shofar blown and therefore can fulfill the commandment for others. This is a good example of a general tendency embodied in all of these Jewish ritual laws and in Jewish civil law, namely that the rabbis restricted a disabled person's duties and eligibility only to those areas affected by the disability. Now let us look at a few of Jewish civil laws related to the disabled. In general, deaf mutes were categorized together with insane people and minors because the rabbis had no way of knowing whether deaf mutes understood what was happening or not. As a result, deaf mutes, like minors and the insane, were not given much legal status. The blind and crippled, on the other hand, were presumed to have full legal competence, except in areas that required someone to see or walk. In other words, Jewish law worried most about legal competence, what American lawyers would call mens rea, and that was much more likely to be compromised by mental rather than physical disabilities. Here then are some examples of Jewish civil laws relating to the disabled. An insane person and a minor who does not realize the value of an object cannot acquire title for themselves or for others. Only an agent of sound mind, such as a parent, can acquire title for them. A deaf mute and a minor who can understand an object's value, however, can acquire title for themselves, although not for others. Because inheritance to and from blood relatives requires no legal transfer of property, but rather occurs automatically at death, both an insane person and a deaf mute can make bequests and receive them. In both cases, though, a trustee or guardian must be appointed to look after their affairs. An insane person cannot buy or sell property, but a deaf mute and even a minor can buy or sell movable property, but not real estate, in order to sustain themselves. Someone who sometimes was of sound mind and sometimes not, such as an epileptic, has full ability to buy or sell both movable property and real estate while of sound mind, but witnesses must take steps to ensure that it is indeed the case that the person is within sound mind during the transaction. Even though there were restrictions on the ability of deaf mutes, insane people, and minors to acquire property, someone who took away anything from such people had committed theft. Insane people were not held liable at law, and if the situation required it, a guardian was appointed to protect the interest of both the insane person and those who might suffer as a result of his or her legal immunity. An insane person may never serve as a witness, and even a sane person who is confused about a given matter may not serve as a witness about that matter. Those who are sometimes sane and sometimes insane must be tested to ascertain their eligibility as a witness. The deaf and mute were also excluded from most testimony because the rabbis, interpreting Leviticus 5, determined that one must be able not only to hear, but to speak in order to testify. The Torah's verse requiring that witnesses see what happened also excluded the blind from testifying, even if they recognized the voices of the parties. Moreover, since these disabilities barred a person from serving as a witness, they also excluded them from being eligible to serve as a judge. An insane person could not marry because such a person could not legally consent, but a deaf mute could.